Here's a song that I wrote about 3 weeks ago. Every once in a while I like to write something to my creator because I believe in him. We need you right now. There's no one else to turn to but you, yeah. You're the only answer to the situation that we've gotten ourselves into. So Master, won't you please come down and give us a helping hand, 'cause we need you. We need you right now. There's a lot of people going hungry 'cause they can't get nothing to eat. There's a lot of people going naked, naked. They ain't even got clothes to put on their feet. So Master, won't you please come down and give us a helping hand. Yeah, 'cause we need you. Say we need you right now. Right now. Right now, Lordy. Say we need you right now. I said we need you, yes we do. We need you right now. I said man has gotten out of hand with his evil ways, yeah, yeah, yeah. Can't you see that he is destroying us? Just a little bit more each and every day. So Master, right now. Yeah, yeah.
Well, welcome everyone to Baha'i Chat, a conversation series dedicated to our interconnectedness. It's an uplifting moment when we can turn our thoughts to spiritual ideas. Each session is rooted in the Baha'i writings and the fundamental teachings of the oneness of God, the oneness of religion, and the oneness of mankind, led by individuals who are putting these principles into action. With recent harrowing events in the United States, Baha'i Chat is focusing our current programming on issues of racial justice and amplifying voices of people of color. We're live streaming today's conversation on Facebook. You can find the link for that live stream in the chat box at the bottom of your Zoom view. And you can share right now by clicking on that link, which will take you to our Facebook page where you can simply select share. Baha'is believe that we are living in the great day of God, foretold by each of God's previous messengers who've established the major world religions. All of these divine educators are connected. Their messages are progressive, always leading mankind forward to new levels of unity. Each has been the bearer of a preordained message, essential for the times. God's latest manifestation and founder of the Baha'i faith is Baha'u'llah. That's an Arabic title meaning the glory of God. Baha'u'llah appeared in Iran in the middle of the 19th century, bringing an unprecedented volume of teachings with the overarching essential mission of the unification of the entire human race, a reality promised in the scriptures associated with each of God's former messengers. The needs of mankind have evolved through the ages, and this is the reason that God has revealed his teachings progressively, every 500 to 1,000 years, through a succession of divine messengers. Each has upheld the essential spiritual laws which are eternal, but they have also updated and abrogated social laws that were meant for the times of a former revelation. Referring to the progressive nature of revelation, Baha'u'llah writes this: "The all-knowing physician hath his finger on the pulse of mankind. The remedy the world needeth in its present day afflictions can never be the same as that which a subsequent age may require. Be anxiously concerned with the needs of the age ye live in, and center your deliberations on its exigencies and requirements." One of the unique features of the Baha'i revelation was the establishment by Baha'u'llah of a covenant that for the first time in religious history clearly identified the succession of authority subsequent to his passing. In this manner, Baha'u'llah has protected his faith from schism and division and ensures its fundamental unity for the duration of his revelation, which is to last for at least 1,000 years. Following some 70 years of leadership in the hands of Baha'u'llah's eldest son, center of his covenant, Abdul-Baha, and great-grandson and guardian of the Baha'i faith, Shoghi Effendi, respectively, and once the faith had spread throughout the world, a democratically elected body called for expressly in Baha'u'llah's writings, consisting of 9 individuals, elected every 5 years by the Baha'is of the world, was established. The first election of the Universal House of Justice was held in 1963. That institution will, for the duration of the Baha'i cycle, guide the growing body of the Baha'is of the world. Loving dedication to the Universal House of Justice, situated on the slope of Mount Carmel in Israel, as prophesied by the Israelite prophets some 3,000 years ago, will, according to Baha'u'llah's own writings, continue to ensure the essential unity of the entire Baha'i world, an unprecedented accomplishment in human history. Today, we're going to be speaking about the urgent need to eradicate racism and to move toward a society rooted in justice for all citizens in the United States. our distinguished panel will be exploring the most recent message from the Universal House of Justice, the latest in a series of admonitions to the American Baha'i community, stretching back to that institution's earliest days, as they've enunciated upon themes of unity and the abolition of all forms of prejudice that have populated the writings of the Baha'i faith for a century and a half. Before turning this over to our panel, let me just conclude by saying that the letter that is today's topic for study is addressed to the Baha'is of the United States. It is being studied in great depth in groups in hundreds of Baha'i communities throughout the country. And we realize, as the letter clearly states, that just as our fellow countrymen, we too are steeped in a centuries-old culture of white supremacy and systemic racism. We as Baha'is are not immune from this pernicious disease. We're not preaching to our peers, but humbly inviting you to join us as we walk this long and thorny path toward racial justice together. At the conclusion of this hour, we'll have a 5-minute intermission so that those who would like to ask questions can engage. The Q&A will follow that intermission. If you need to go, no worries. Please feel free to write your questions in the Q&A box at any time throughout the panel discussion. And now, it's my pleasure to turn this over to one of our program's curators, Dr. Layli Maparyan. Layli is the Catherine Stone Kaufman 67 Executive Director of the Wellesley Center for Women and Professor and Chair of Africana Studies at Wellesley College. Layli, welcome to the chat, and please introduce your co-curator and guest panelists.
Thanks, David. It's great to be back. Last month, we launched the Baha'i Chat Racial Justice Series with a discussion of a message from the National Spiritual Assembly of the Baha'is of the United States to the people of the United States. And that letter came not just to the Baha'is, but to everybody. For those who are with us today, just learning about the Baha'i faith, the National Spiritual Assembly, or NSA for short, is also a 9-member elected governing body of the US Baha'i community. In their letter, which came out on Juneteenth, the NSA asserted that the pursuit of racial justice requires, quote, a reordering of our society more profound than anything we have yet achieved, unquote, and noted that it, quote, requires the participation of Americans of every race and background, unquote. Notable was the NSA's assertion that the pursuit of racial justice requires, quote, honest and truthful discourse about current conditions and their causes, unquote, particularly, quote, the deeply entrenched notions of anti-Blackness that pervade our society, unquote. In the end, we were encouraged to look towards the untapped resources for advancing racial justice that can be found in religion as a reservoir of, quote, insight concerning human purpose and action, unquote, because, quote, all faith communities recognize that we are essentially spiritual beings, unquote. Inherent in our spirituality is nobility and oneness, two of the true antidotes to racism. In July, as you mentioned, David, the Universal House of Justice addressed a letter directly to the Baha'is of the United States to continue the conversation about racial justice, and in particular how and with what kind of spirit we can participate in the global movement for racial justice that's emerging all around us now. It's to that letter that we're turning today's discussion, and in the spirit of a humble posture of learning, we invite all of you to think and learn along with us. So now, as you said, David, I'd like to introduce my co-curator of this Baha'i Chat Racial Justice series, Masud Olufani. Masud is an accomplished multidisciplinary artist, actor, and writer based in Atlanta. He's exhibited in museums and galleries all over the country and has appeared in numerous movies and TV shows in both the news and entertainment arenas. He also hosts a podcast that might be of great interest to everyone watching today. It's called America's Most Challenging Issue, and it can be found on BahaiBlog.net. I urge everybody to check it out. There's a lot more I could say about Masud, but in the interest of time, let me turn things over to you, Masud.
Thank you, Layli. It's so good to see you again and to be able to open this space and to share this space with you and with our extraordinary guests that we have joining us today. So I'm so excited to be engaging with you again around this most challenging of issues and vital of issues that America is facing. I'm going to begin by introducing our distinguished panelists who will be joining us today. And then we will do a reading through the July 22nd letter from the Universal House of Justice, as you so beautifully introduced. And then after that, we will have some discussion about the letter. So I'm going to go ahead and get started with that. I would like to begin by first introducing Dr. Sahar Satarzadeh. She is a daughter of former refugee settlers of the Azeri and mixed Iranian-Persian descent. She is an assistant professor of education studies at DePaul University in Indiana. And she has also served as a research associate at the Chair for Critical Studies in Higher Education and Transformation at Nelson Mandela University on the traditional lands of the Gokobi, San, and later Anahosa in Port Elizabeth, South Africa. Hope I didn't butcher that too much, but welcome, Sahar. Good to see you.
Thanks for having me here.
Oh,
You were close.
it was good. Thank you. We're gonna work that out later. I need some tutoring later on, okay? Our next guest is brother Dennis Davis, who's an amazing guy. He has been facilitating diversity workshops since 1987. He truly believes in the oneness of mankind. Dennis believes the unconscious exclusive behavior hurts everyone, and that it's not just the occasional riot or hate crime that impacts us the most. He believes that it is the daily dose of tension, suspicion, and distrust that eats away at human potential. He also believes that frank and honest consultation among diverse groups of Americans will set such a powerful example that it will encourage peace and cooperation around the world. Welcome, Dennis Davis. Good to see you, brother.
Thanks for having me.
So as I stated before, we're gonna just dive right in. You guys feeling all right? Y'all ready to go? Okay, all right. We have some, we have assigned readers already ready, set to go. I think we're doing girl, boy, girl, and each of them will take 2 paragraphs and we'll maneuver through the letter. The audience can follow us as we are reading. So Layli, if you will be so kind to take us away, I would love that.
To the Baha'is of the United States, dear Baha'i friends, a moment of historic portent has arrived for your nation as the conscience of its citizenry has stirred, creating possibilities for marked social change. It holds significance not only for the destiny of America anticipated in the sacred writings, but also for the mission entrusted to your community by the hand of Abdu'l-Baha, who cherished you dearly and called you to a path of sacrifice and high endeavor. We are pleased to see that, led by your national and local spiritual assemblies, you are seizing opportunities, whether those thrust upon you by current circumstances or those derived from your systematic labors in the wider society, to play your part, however humble, in the effort to remedy the ills of your nation. We ardently pray that the American people will grasp the possibilities of this moment to create a consequential reform of the social order that will free it from the pernicious effects of racial prejudice and will hasten the attainment of a just, diverse, and united society that can increasingly manifest the oneness of the human family. Sadly, however, your nation's history reveals that any significant progress towards racial equality has invariably been met by countervailing processes, overt or covert, that served to undermine the advances achieved and to reconstitute the forces of oppression by other means. Thus, whatever the immediate outcome of contemporary events, you need not be deterred, for you are cognizant of the long and thorny road beset with pitfalls described by the Guardian that still lies ahead. Your commitment to tread this road with determination and insight, drawing upon what you have learned in recent years about translating Baha'u'llah's teachings into reality, will have to be sustained until the time, anticipated by Shoghi Effendi, when you will have contributed your decisive share to the eradication of racial prejudice from the fabric of your nation.
The principles and exhortations that guide your steps are well known to you from the writings of Abdu'l-Baha and Shoghi Effendi. The concepts and approaches for social transformation developed in the current series of plans that can be utilized to promote race unity in the context of community building, social action, and involvement in the discourses of society have been set out in our messages. Every believer, as a promulgator of Baha'u'llah's central principles of the oneness of humanity, should deeply meditate upon it and weigh its demanding implications for the profound alteration of thought and action required at this time. The American Baha'i community, the leaven destined to leaven the whole, the guarding admonish, cannot hope to either escape the trials with which this nation is confronted, nor claim to be wholly immune from the evils that stain its character. A tremendous effort is required by both races if their outlook, their manners, and conduct are to reflect in this darkened age the spirit and teachings of the faith of Baha'u'llah. He also stated, "Let neither think that the solution of so vast a problem is a matter that exclusively concerns the other. Let neither think that such a problem can either easily or immediately be resolved. Each one should endeavor to develop and assist the other toward mutual advancement." Abdul-Baha explained, "Love and unity will be fostered between you, thereby bringing about the oneness of mankind." Racism is a profound deviation from the standard of true morality. It deprives a portion of humanity of the opportunity to cultivate and express the full range of their capability and to live a meaningful and flourishing life, while blighting the progress of the rest of humankind. It cannot be rooted out by contest and conflict. It must be supplanted by the establishment of just relationships among individuals, communities, and institutions of society that will uplift all and will not designate anyone as other. The change required is not merely social and economic, but above all, moral and spiritual. Within the context of the framework governing your activities, it is necessary to carefully examine the forces unfolding around you to determine where your energies might reinforce the most promising initiatives, what you should avoid, and how you might lend a distinctive contribution. It is not possible for you to effect the transformation envisioned by Baha'u'llah merely by adopting the perspectives, practices, concepts, criticisms, and language of contemporary society. Your approach instead will be distinguished by maintaining a humble posture of learning, weighing alternatives in the light of his teachings, consulting to harmonize differing views and shape collective action, and marching forward with unbreakable unity in serried lines.
Ultimately, the power to transform the world is effected by love. Love originating from the relationship with the divine, love ablaze among members of a community, love extended without restriction to every human being. This divine love, ignited by the word of God, is disseminated by enkindled souls through intimate conversations that create new susceptibilities in human hearts, open minds to moral persuasion, and loosen the hold of biased norms and social systems so that they can gradually take on a new form in keeping with the requirements of humanity's age of maturity. You are channels for this divine love. Let it flow through you to all who cross your path. Infuse it into every neighborhood and social space in which you move to build capacity, to canalize the society-building power of Baha'u'llah's revelation. There can be no rest until the destined outcome is achieved. Ahead of you lie times of trial and promise, of hardship and progress, of anguish and joy. Under all conditions, the Master is your solace and support. For those who aspire to lasting change, his example guides the way, tactful and wise in his approach, penetrating in utterance, indiscriminating in fellowship, unfailing in sympathy for the downtrodden, courageous in conduct, persevering in action, imperturbable in the face of tests, unwavering in his keen sense of justice. And to all who arise to emulate him, he offers this unfailing assurance. That which is confirmed is the oneness of the world of humanity. Every soul who serveth this oneness will undoubtedly be assisted and confirmed. Signed, the Universal House of Justice.
Wow, quite a lot to chew on. Thank you all for reading so beautifully. Well, I think the only thing to do is just to jump in and to begin to do a more in-depth analysis of what you just read. So I've prepared a few questions just as starting points for us to kind of engage in conversation. And so I'll begin by sharing those. The first one is, you know, we're in a remarkable moment as the nation is wrestling with the consequences of its racialized past. A diverse cohort of citizens are demanding change with an ever more insistent voice, and yet, as inspiring as this moment is, we know that just articulating our discontent is only the beginning in a far-reaching process. According to this letter, what we are seeking is no less than a, quote, consequential reform of the social order that will free it from the pernicious effects of racial prejudice. And I'm wondering how this part of the letter resonates with you. And I would love to begin with Layli, if that's all right, and just hear your thoughts on that. You're on mute, Layli. There you go. Thanks.
Thank you, Masud. I know that this is one of my favorite parts of the letter because it's really an invitation to all of us to use this moment to radically reimagine what our society can be like and to begin to take the kinds of actions that can change the social context. One that I personally think about quite a bit is the degree to which a culture of oppositionality has become entrenched in the United States to the point where people are always viewing themselves in terms of being opposed to somebody else. And to some extent, those oppositions are racial. They also are sometimes related to political party. They're sometimes related to social class or education or geography. You know, people are finding all kinds of ways. So this is a moment to reimagine how we might reverse that and begin to institute a process in our culture that's based on fundamental kinship of all of us. One that is based on inviting one another to connect, to collaborate, to come together, to recognize what we have in common, and to put that at the center of our relationships, political, economic, educational, cultural, and so on. And so to me, one of the most profound transformations of our culture that we could make right now is simply to figure out how to rout out this culture of oppositionality that only seems to be getting worse and more painful with every passing day, and to substitute it with something that's based on kinship, community, unity, and love.
Beautiful. Sahar, you have any thoughts on that?
It's interesting because, you know, even though this letter is written to the American Baha'is, the quote that is cited is talking about all American people. And so this idea of, like Layli is talking about, there's so much contention in terms of the discourse of racial injustice and anti-Blackness happening right now, and even anti-Indigenousness, right? And to think about this idea of how American people will come up with a consequential reform, it means this idea of having a unified vision. We don't have to have the same one, but to have a unified approach in how we address this, I think is going to be a great challenge that we can achieve, right? We're told we can achieve it, but in terms of when, that's a whole nother factor. But how, I think we have the guidance in this letter as we move forward to discuss that in terms of what are different steps in terms of how we can move forward.
Thank you. Dennis, any thoughts that you're having about this particular section of the letter? You're on mute, brother.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I was listening. I just kind of got caught up in listening to Layli and Sahar.
Yeah.
It really is about a shift, right? You know, how do we make that shift? And how do we shift gears from what we've done in the past, which is to have these so-called conversations, not very elevated conversations, because they lack a component. And that's that spiritual component. Yeah. And think of all the programs that have been created and all the money and the resources that have been thrown at this deal, sometimes half-heartedly, and sometimes with the best of intentions. And yet we find ourselves almost on a treadmill. It's the same old, same old, same old, you know, and even in light of all the things that are happening, you still have people questioning, why won't certain people just behave? Why won't they just listen to what law enforcement is telling them? And we see all of this and we're still stuck because we have not made that shift to have a different conversation about this from the point of being able to recognize everyone's humanity. And if we can't recognize everyone's humanity and we can't recognize the nobility of each individual, we're going to have a hard time having honest and uplifting conversations because, quite frankly, some people aren't looking through the lens of nobility. They're looking through the lens of otherness, and they're looking through the lens of you are different from me. You are less than me. Therefore, whatever injustices you are experiencing are justified.
Yeah.
So the old adage, before you can mistreat a people, you must first reclassify them. And we really done a number with that, with this myth of race.
Yeah.
You know, there is no such thing as race. And all the scientists have proven this, but we're so invested in this nonsense. It's a huge social construct in our country, huge social construct, but it is a biological myth.
Yeah.
And if we can grasp that concept of understanding that there is only one race of humans, and it's Homo sapiens sapiens, that's all. Yeah. Then that may help us to start beginning to recognize and see each other as full human beings, and thus allow us the opportunity to recognize our nobility. Because until we do that with that spiritual base, then we're going to be on the treadmill.
And Dennis, I'd like to really build on what you said, because even though we know that race is a biological fallacy, we also know that culture is real and beautiful, and that Baha'u'llah upholds cultural diversity as a beautiful gift to our within the oneness. You know, we know that unity and diversity is what it's all about. And part of what this whole anti-racist walk is about recognizing the nobility in all of the world's cultures as well as all the world's individuals, so that we also don't oppress people on a cultural basis, and so that we bring in the wisdom, the knowledge, and all the artistic beauty and everything of every culture into the world system. So part of racism is about rebalancing how cultures interact and recognizing, that culture is real and important.
Unity and diversity, essentially. It's interesting to me because when I think about that concept, I'm thinking about, I think it in terms of music and jazz composing, how you have that central theme, Love Supreme or Miles Davis Kind of Blue. And then you have all of these musicians kind of dancing off that central theme, but they're all held together by that theme and that sense of oneness, that spiritual identity, which unites us all, which is the primary identity. And then we kind of dance off with our cultural expressions, but we're bound together by that central oneness. So really beautiful thoughts. Thank you all so much. Well, moving forward, one of the things that I love about this letter is how clearly it describes the impact of racism on the individual and society as a whole. It rejects fragmentation for an integrated view of society where the health and well-being of the individual is tied to the health and well-being of the community. And I was wondering if you all had any thoughts on this. And I first wanted to talk about this definition of how the letter defines racism, because it gives a clear definition of what it is. And it says racism is a profound deviation from the standard of true morality, right? It deprives a portion of humanity of the opportunity to cultivate and express the full range of their capability and to live a meaningful and flourishing life while blighting the progress of the rest of humankind. So the letter, for me, it resonates for me because it's really defining this intrinsic relationship between the individual and the community, right? And I'm really interested because I think as we're engaging in these meaningful conversations, we're hopefully entering these spaces with transparency and a deep sense of honesty, right? And I'm interested in hearing from you your experiences with racism. And of course, this could be a long drawn out response. So please try to Confine it as much as you can. I'm wondering where, when your experience, your interactions, when you were engaged in a situation that for you is clearly a racist situation, whether that was in your past or recent, where that lands in your body. Because I think something that I've discovered from myself recently, particularly with the last shooting that took place where a brother was shot 7 times in the back in front of his kids. Now, we all have seen these shootings that have gone on, the murders of Brother Brooks, Arbery, so forth and so on. And those hit me in a certain way. But there was something about this last shooting that it physically affected me. I did not want to leave the house. I was afraid of my body in public space. I had a deep sense of anxiety and apprehension. I could feel it almost at a cellular level. And I think sometimes we can get into these discussions around the issue of race and they become macro, right? We talk about it in broad terms. But I think it's as important for people maybe who have not had those experiences, perhaps to gain a window into what it feels like by hearing from us how it feels in the body. So I'm wondering if you all can speak to that, how your interaction with racism, your experience with racism, how it lands in your body. Anybody can take that first.
I'm sure we all have stories to tell. I mean, for me, I think that it creates this kind of substrate of anxiety, and it extends not just through myself, but into my feelings about my family. For example, I have anxiety whenever my family members go walking around in the neighborhood. You know, my husband wants to take a walk, or my kids want to take a walk, or somebody wants to run to the corner store. I feel anxiety, like, be careful, make sure you come back, don't go out after dark. You know, like, I just, things that I shouldn't have to care about. I feel this sort of low grade anxiety that's always there about their moving about. And I also feel it in terms of a great deal of self-monitoring, meaning I'm always aware of my racial presentation and the people around me. So a piece of my brain that could be used for whatever I'm there to do is always being used to monitor, and not just monitor myself, but monitor my family. I'm like, oh, how are people perceiving us? If we do it this way, what will happen? You know, it's a complex navigation, particularly in professional environments, you know, places where I find myself for work, and so on. There's never feeling like I can just relax and be myself 100% all the time. I'm always monitoring my presentation. So I know that's not exactly in the body, but it's sort of psycho body, and you know, there's something there.
Yeah, thank you. Sahar, Dennis. Sahar?
So obviously we all have different experiences, right? Based on our phenotype and even the context in which we're in. And it was interesting. So I recently moved from Burlington, Vermont, which has about it's the second whitest state in the country, Vermont. I've never lived in a space that was like that. And for the first time, I was identified as POC, person of color, you know, and I had just come from South Africa, was living there. So the context was different. And it was when it reminds me of what Layli is saying with regards to feeling it through other bodies, and this idea of even what Dennis introduced of the connection of the soul and the nobility of people. So at the time I was engaged to a Black man who is now my husband, but George Floyd had just been killed. And my mom called and she's choked up. And I said, Mom, what's wrong? And my grandfather, his health was very precarious. He was actually about to transition. And so I thought it was my grandfather. And I said, Mom, what's wrong? And she said, that poor man, George Floyd, why did they do that? And she just bawled. And uncontrollably, I had never experienced my mom feeling like that. And so her emotions kind of triggered me. I had already been dealing with it. And the thing is, whenever my husband drives out anywhere because of experience he's already had, but even because of what media has amplified in terms of what happens to Black bodies, I was even hypersensitized. Like it was even more, and it's interesting when you ask where in the body is it felt. I'm sure it's different for everyone. I mean, there's aspects of the mind and the heart, but I think there's also this spiritual element that is felt in the body that you can't pinpoint exactly where it is, that touches on, you know, that paragraph where you shared this quote, the opening quote about the fact that racism is also about this idea of lacking this true morality, right?
Mhm.
And the fact that there's spiritual moral elements of it, and how is that felt in the body, right? Yeah, I think I still unfortunately have it in my body. Of course, like I said, in a different way, because I live it through my husband and what he experiences, but also because of how I perceive other people in terms of still striving to understand the fact that I see these people as noble people I do not know, and how that still affects me in ways I cannot even explain.
Mm.
So I think your question in some degrees is difficult to answer in a more physical, material, literal sense.
Yeah. Yeah.
Still, you know, still processing it.
Mm. Thank you. Thank you for that. Dennis?
Well, you
Mm.
said you were going to throw us for a loop.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
You know, it was interesting, the wide range of emotions
Mhm.
that I felt when I first watched the George Floyd murder.
Yeah.
Um, it it was it was it was a painful reminder.
Yeah.
A painful reminder of where we are
Mhm.
in this country
Mhm.
and the reality of what we're dealing with.
Mhm.
And for me, it was doubly infuriating because my first job out of college was law enforcement.
Mm.
And we have arrested all kinds of people without using lethal force, deadly force. You know, most of the times when we get called, it's not because people are being compliant,
Yeah.
right? It's because people are not being compliant, or they're doing something that they should not be doing. So to roll up on a scene and to think somebody's just going to be just, you know, nice and polite, that's not reality.
Mhm.
But if you are trained properly,
Mhm.
you know how to de-escalate.
Mhm. Mhm.
And you only use that force which is necessary to control the situation.
Mhm.
And so it becomes doubly infuriating to me.
Mm.
I don't care what George Floyd was doing.
Mhm.
Let's say he did pass a phony $20 bill.
Mhm.
Okay. He didn't deserve that.
Mhm.
And at the point where he was in handcuffs,
Mhm.
that was it. It was over.
Mhm.
It should have been over. And so for me, the act was painful, but what happened after the act was even more painful.
Mhm.
The justification, the
Mhm.
questioning. Well, if he woulda, he shoulda, coulda. And then I see this kid, and gosh, I know his name. It just evaded me because I'm so taken aback by this. The kid down in South Carolina that walked into the church
Mhm.
and murdered 9 people.
Mhm.
He killed 9 people,
Mhm.
had a weapon on his person, and was taken into custody without a scratch.
Mhm.
To add insult to injury, they fed him Burger King.
Mhm.
You see, that is like a double slap.
Yeah.
When people are questioning, well, what did he do? He didn't comply. If he would just stop resisting. This guy allegedly passed a phony $20 bill. He ends up dead
Mhm.
with the so-called officer's knee on his neck for 8 minutes and 46 seconds for the world to see. And people are still questioning, what is the problem? Why are you upset?
Mhm.
Right?
Mhm.
And so for me, it was interesting because a lot of the friends called to check on us. And I told all of my friends, particularly my white friends,
Mhm.
I need a little time.
Yeah.
I just need a little time because I felt it in my heart, in my gut. I mean, it was almost paralyzing for me,
Mhm.
right?
Mhm.
And so Some of them couldn't understand that, why I needed time.
Yeah.
And I said, I just need time to just get myself together and really think about this and ground myself, because I don't really need to talk to anybody right now, because it's not going to be a healthy conversation, because I'm so upset about this. It impacted my wife so deeply. She watched it, and dear Katrina, you know, she's a OBGYN and a urogynecologist. She's double boarded, and she had a hard time going to work, practicing her medicine, right? Because it impacted her just that much.
Yeah.
And then to go back into these spaces, and then, you know, let's just face it, the higher you move up, the more wider the spaces are going to be, right?
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, I'm going to say me, not we. I am fully aware that I am being watched and observed and critiqued and marginalized. And, you know, I'm fully aware that in these spaces that's happening. And over time, you just get used to it. You just get used to it because it is what it is. Then you need to come home and you need to have your other groups and other things where you can exhale and you can be yourself. But I think it is I was explaining this, and I was finally able to, when I finally talked to someone, they asked me, and I said, being a conscious Black man in this country is being in a constant state of uneasiness. Constant state of uneasiness, how I walk, how I talk, where I go, because of how I'm perceived. It is exhausting. But then it becomes super painful when we see this incident and people want to act as if there's justification for these murders and they're still happening, even though they know the world is watching. So it's.
I thank you all. I mean, I think, you know, this is, you know, we see the visible toll of racial trauma on the community, right? We see people getting murdered, you know, in front of us via, you know, electronic devices, so forth and so on. But what we're also not aware of quite oftentimes, or what we dismiss too often, is the psychic, spiritual toll that these incidents take on the community as a whole. And I think that is something, through telling these stories and being transparent with the community, we're able to communicate perhaps a small part of that puts what the House of Justice is saying in context, because it personalizes it. And so that was my whole point of proposing. I didn't mean to, well, in a way I did mean to throw y'all off a little bit, but I felt it was worth going there because I thought we needed to have that kind of transparency. So let's pull back out and let's discuss how racism's blight on society, how it stunts the forward progress of humanity as a whole. So how is the individual linked to the forward progress of the whole? And how, if we are engaged, you can't separate the well-being of the individual from the well-being of the whole. So we are all interconnected, and I'm interested in that last quotation that we looked at is related to this question, that relationship between the individual to society, how you all process that in terms of the importance of the eradication of racism from our society, how it's, you know, linked to that. So anyone. Sahar, why don't you start off? Why don't you go first?
So regarding this concept of the individual and the collective, one of my favorite analogies that are in the Baha'i writings is this analogy of the human body and how we are all members of one human body, and how if you feel pain or even pleasure in one part of the body, it's connected to, or joy, it's connected to other parts of the body. And I think it's really problematic. We live in a very individualistic society. that thinks the self. And I think this context of COVID-19 is an excellent example in how the fact that we can't deny our connectedness and interconnectedness and interdependency, right? We can't disconnect or detach ourselves from this idea that we rely on one another indirectly or directly, whether we even pay attention to it or not. And I think for me to say that this whole narrow lens of, oh yeah, I'm going to live a racially just life, and I'll be free of prejudice, and every single phase of my life means that every other person that I encounter in every single social space that I encounter is going to be connected, right? I believe in the advent of divine justice, Shoghi Effendi says that in every phase of your life that you should advocate and live for racial justice and racial unity and be free of racial prejudice. And so if I'm doing that in every single aspect of my life, I don't live on an island. I can't even survive as an individual by myself. That's not human nature. And so it doesn't make sense. Even the fact that I teach at a university, how can I not connect with my students in a way, with my colleagues, and even with the university in a way that is, racist in this insular bubble, but no one else is affected? I don't understand. It's scary to think that we are very internal or inward, but I think this idea of recognizing the nobility of one another and the fact that if the spirit or the soul is the most noble of all phenomenon of humankind, then how do we actually show this in every single phase of our lives? It's impossible to fight against racism, in every phase of my life if I'm doing it at the individual level and saying it's separate from the collective. It's not the social reality in which we live.
Sorry, now I muted myself. Dennis, you have some thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's interesting. I'm gonna take a little different approach, and I'm gonna try to cut to the chase and keep my words short. That fourth paragraph that in the letter that starts with racism is a profound deviation from the standard of true morality. That is just heavy.
Yeah,
it's really heavy how the Universal House of Justice was so clear about the nature of this disease. And they also mentioned it in 1985 when they said racism, one of the most baneful and persistent evils, is a major barrier to peace. So now we're talking about peace, right? And it says its practice perpetuates too outrageous a violation on the dignity of human beings to be countenanced under any pretext. Then they go on to say that racism retards the unfoldment of the boundless potentialities of its victims. It corrupts its perpetrators and blights human progress. It's a lose-lose-lose situation for all parties involved. Even though people think that they may be taking advantage of other people with this so-called racial system that we have here, it corrupts the perpetrators. So no matter how you look at it, how you dice it up and how you slice it up, it's no good for anybody. And the sooner we recognize that, the sooner we're going to be able to progress, and we got to move. Because I simply believe, and this I always have believed, in order to hold somebody back, you got to get down there with them to hold them back, right? So you're also holding yourself back, right? So it's really counterproductive to impede other people's progress, and it blights human progress. So think about the people who, not just the ones who have been murdered, but the ones who have been marginalized because they looked a certain way, and were told they weren't smart, they weren't intelligent. We don't know what their potential could have been. We don't know what they would have done, what contributions they could have made. And so you have this whole thing of internalized oppression where people are hating themselves because the system has told us to do so. And so they're not living up to their full potential. And we don't know what contributions they might have made. It is really, and the way the Universal House of Justice defines it, it's really clear, it's really stark, and it's really radical, because I don't know any other institution that's speaking to this in this manner.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you both so much. We are getting close to the end of this part of the session, and we still have 2 questions. I think we're going to be able to get through one more. Layli, do you have something that's burning on your heart to share in this segment, or can we jump to the next question?
Jump ahead, because I'm sure I can circle back.
Okay. Oftentimes we rely on the standards of society in our attempts to rid ourselves of the challenges that confront us. Now, much of the present discourse on race is based on models of conflict and contention that often result in a number of competing approaches that jockey for attention. Now, this letter counsels us on the ineffectiveness of, quote, merely adopting the perspectives, practices, concepts, criticisms, and language of contemporary society as a means of effecting lasting change. Now, according to your understanding of the Baha'i approach, how do the teachings of Baha'u'llah chart a new and revolutionary course in our collective journey towards the eradication of racism? Layli, would you like to start with that?
Sure. I think that something very challenging yet significant is being asked of us. And that is that even in the face of racism and its virulence, and even in the face of having to protect ourselves and our families from violence and harm, we also have to find it within ourselves and help others find it within themselves to continue to see all human beings as part of humanity, part of a unified human family. So racists and non-racists alike, people who you like and you don't like alike, we're all part of the same family. So you have to figure out what is the way that you can both acknowledge that and still acknowledge the ways in which we need to grow together towards a different reality. As a developmental psychologist, one of the things that I can say about this situation is that a lot of times people turn to hate when their basic needs are not met. And they do a mental gymnastic that makes them view someone else as being at fault when really they aren't. We all have basic needs that need to be met, whether they're economic needs, whether they're physical needs, whether they're social needs, whether they're needs for self-esteem. And our society has gone to a place where the failure to make sure that all of us have what we need has generated all kinds of deformities in our culture. And I view a lot of the hate that we see around us as a function of the fact that our society isn't meeting anybody's basic needs, and the extent to which we follow the example of Abdu'l-Baha, which was to love and serve everyone and to find our strength from the divine and from this vision of humanity in which we are all interconnected, and to every day wake up anew and through prayer and service to find that place over and over. I believe that that's at least part of what's being called for.
Thank you. Thank you. Sahar, any thoughts?
Going to this idea of racism, and we don't really link it to morality. We don't link it oftentimes to this idea of spiritual deprivation or morality. And going to, what Dennis said, that it's not a win-win for anybody. It's a lose-lose. Everyone loses. But this idea that what we see about racism in the world, and even what the discourses often are about, even the activist spaces, are very much about the socioeconomic detriments of racism, right? We don't often talk about the moral and spiritual deprivation of it, which the oppressor and the perpetrators, it's not visible. Those are things we don't see. When we seek justice, we seek it in a material way, right? Sometimes we think that, it has to be done through legal means. I'm not saying that I'm against that. I'm just saying that we don't also look at the deeper spiritual and moral implications. So this idea of adopting a humble posture of learning, humble having this Latin root of meaning ground.
Mhm.
And the fact that we have people who are entering these discourses in activist spaces or, media, or whatever spaces these conversations are happening in, whether it's through personal lived experiences, that's their knowledge and that's their education. There's some people who study it, they teach about it, they write about it. That's one experience. There's some people who have no clue what's going on, but want to learn more, and then, there's just all these different, but we all have blind spots in these conversations. And so to have this idea of bringing in this humble posture of learning and not merely replicating and perpetuating what's happening in these spaces, I think it touches on that sentence from the third paragraph of the letter, where Shoghi Effendi is referenced and saying that the U.S. Baha'i community cannot hope to either escape the trials with which this nation is confronted, nor claim to be wholly immune from the evils that stain its character. So we all have complicity. So how do we bring humility into that? And how I think Baha'u'llah's revelation helps us be like, I need to check myself, but also spiritually and morally, what does that look like? Not just in terms of, legislation or policy or, defunding police, which are very important issues, but what also spiritually and morally are we doing in terms of our actions?
Thank you, Sahar. Thank you. Brother Dennis, you want to get the last word before we take a little break?
Oh, my dear brother, that's some heavy lifting there. I think that, Sahar, you opened up a can when you were talking about that third paragraph where we can't be immune. And I think part of the challenge, particularly with us within the Baha'i faith, is an acknowledgement that we have work to do. We have work to do. I think there is an unrealistic expectation that because we are Baha'is and because we believe in the onennesses, we believe in the leaves of one tree and the drops of one ocean, that we are immune from this disease that the Universal House of Justice has reminded us that we cannot hope to either escape the trials with which this nation is confronted or claim to be wholly immune from the evils that stain its character. It doesn't mean we aren't good people. It doesn't mean we aren't good Baha'is. It means that because we are brought up in this society, we too have been infected with this disease, right? And anybody living in these United States of America that says, I don't have a quote unquote racist bone in my body, or I don't see that, you're on drugs. It's equivalent to saying, I'm going to get in the water and not get wet. It's weaved into the very fabric of our society. And so it doesn't make us wrong or bad people. We just have to acknowledge that. And we have to do what the guidance is asking us to do. And that's that humble, part of that humble posture of learning is being honest with self. And we want to take the banner and we want to lead the charge. And we haven't humbled ourselves and treated ourselves. It's kind of like, I often use the analogy with this disease, and I'm not talking about COVID. I'm talking about this pandemic that's been going on for over 400 years, right? When you fly on a plane, the flight attendants will often tell us, we don't expect any problems, but in the event of an emergency, oxygen mask will descend from above your head. Place the oxygen mask on yourself first, then assist others. That's what we got to do.
Thank you for that beautiful, beautiful analogy. Thank you, Brother Dennis. Well, we have come to the end of this portion of our time together. We are going to take a bit of a 5-minute break. And then when we come back, we're going to do a Q&A, question and answer. And we're going to pick up on a very important part of this letter that we weren't able to get to in this first segment, which is on the issue of divine love, and that being the ultimate remedy for the illness of the disease of racism. So with that, we will take a little bit of a break for 5 minutes, and we will come back and we'll pick up with the second half of this discussion. Thank you all so much. All of the panelists and my co-host, they always making me look good. So I appreciate y'all. And we'll see you all in 5 minutes.
about to step this one right.
Everything is everything. What is meant to be will be. After winter, must come spring. Change it comes eventually. I wrote these words for everyone who struggles in their youth.
Do this one for the
Who won't accept deception instead of what is true.
gotta know the truth, y'all.
It seems we lose the game before we even start to play.
Not our game.
Who made these rules? We're so confused. Easily led astray. Let me tell you that everything is everything. Everything is everything. Everything is everything. Everything. After winter must come spring. Everything is everything. Our philosophy possibly speak tongues, beat drums at Vicinity Street Baptist. Rap this and fine linen from the beginning. My practice extending across the atlas. I begat this, flipping it together on the dirty mattress. You can't match this. Rapper / actress, more powerful than two Cleopatra. Bomb graffiti on the tomb of Nefertiti. MCs ain't ready to take it to the Serengeti. My rhymes is heavy like the mother sister Betty. L Boogie spars with stars and constellations. Then came down for a little conversation. Adjacent to the king, fear no human being. Roll with cherubims to Nassau Coliseum. Now hear this mixture where hip hop meets scripture. Develop a negative into a positive picture. Everything is everything.
Everything, y'all.
What is meant to be will be.
Will be. Must come spring. Change it comes eventually.
Sometimes it seems we'll touch that dream, but things come slow and not at all.
They come slow, you know what I mean?
And the ones on top won't make it stop. So convinced that they might fall.
Not for everybody,
Let's love ourselves and we can't fail to make a better situation.
better situation.
Tomorrow, our seeds will grow. All we need is dedication. Let me tell you that everything is everything. Everything is everything. Everything is everything.
Everything is everything.
After winter, must come spring. Change it comes eventually. La 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 la.
Everything is everything.
Welcome back, everybody. David, please go ahead.
Just you guys, such a powerful conversation, just a privilege to really have this group of contributors with us. You know, as you were, there's so many things going through my own mind just listening. As you were talking earlier, you spoke about the need for a shift from confrontational culture to collaborative culture. And it made me think about the effort over the last 30 years under the Universal House of Justice's guidance, where Baha'is throughout the world joining together with folks of other faiths, folks of no faith, millions of people coming together through a variety of study groups and devotionals, children's classes, youth programs, practicing clear principles of inclusion and cooperation, really striving to improve conditions in their families and communities, and using this, principle of collaboration. The effects have been profound, and I think most interesting is how these potent processes have been so potent regardless of geography or language, any other factor. And what we wanted to do is just invite folks, if you aren't in connection already with a Baha'i, we offer a program called Baha'i Guide. It's a one-on-one opportunity to connect virtually, maybe ask some questions, be guided to some material that will speak to your particular interests, and perhaps introduce you to these activities that are going on in your community, in all communities right now. So please, if you're interested in that, just send an email to info@baha'i.chat and simply write Baha'i Guide in the subject line. That's all you need to do. Well, I'll turn it back over to you, Masud, and the group. It's just such a great honor, really, to have you guys with us.
Thank you, David. It's really a wonderful conversation that we have begun, and we're going to continue with a little Q&A. Incidentally, the first question that we've got in the queue is about love. And so I wanted to kind of preference our engagement with that question around just defining this idea of divine love. And this was the last question that we didn't get to in the previous conversation, but it says, finally, I would like to ask you about the transformative power of love as described in the second to the last paragraph of the letter. How does the reality of divine love contrast with the way we understand love in a material sense? And how does the former activate the energy required to do this challenging work? And I think at this point, we can all just kind of, if you are so inclined, just go ahead and share. Anybody, please.
Love is really a power. It's a form of energy. It's a force. And I think that Baha'u'llah really understands that it is a tool that we can use to remake the world. I think that the Universal House of Justice is trying to frame this understanding about love by noting its divine nature, by connecting it to the invisible world, to the realm of the divine, the source of all that is, and reminding us to connect with that. Love is not merely an emotion. It's not just romance. Love is something much deeper that brings us alive and makes our existence occur at a completely different level. And we're being asked to put that into the service of justice, put that into the service of remaking the world. So that's my initial reaction to this section of the letter.
Dennis, Sahar? Either one?
So this is really the crux of the matter, right? This whole concept of love. And I think it may first require us to reassess our understanding of the word love. What does that mean? And not just our understanding, but what are its applications as we do this community building and as we interact with fellow humans? How does that come into play in our interactions with each other, right? And I think because really it is the basis of everything. Because if you don't have that love, which comes through close connectivity, close relationship, then you don't have a reason to want to do the work to be in that relationship, right? So it's too hard. I don't want to do it. What do I gain from it? What's in it for me? Why do I have to? Anything worth having, we know is worth working for, right? And so when you have that love, and when you have that this spiritual love that the Universal House of Justice describes, this intimate conversations, and it talks about the divine love, right? It's a different paradigm. It's a total different way of seeing things. It's kind of like when I do workshops with teachers, and I think teachers are so powerful. I tell them that the love for your students is what's important, because the students really don't care what you know until they know that you care,
Wow.
right? And so once those students know that their teacher cares, they will do the work over and over and at a high level because there's a connection. They know the teacher loves them. And so once we understand how powerful that is and how the relationships based on love, how that uplifts everybody, how that allows us to be able to see the humanity. I see you, I know you, I love you, you're important to me. It changes, it shifts, it flips everything. And some of these conversations that we're trying to have that we find to be somewhat difficult will become less difficult if we approach it through that. And that love is also connected to that humble posture. We can't love if we don't have that humble posture. And part of that humble posture is assessing ourselves and constantly working on ourselves and developing our capacity to love. And that part of that capacity to love may look like understanding my unconscious conditioning and how I may bring that into the space, how I may bring it into a devotional gathering, how I may bring it into a study circle, a children's class, a junior youth group. I'm bringing my full self. And if I am not aware of my unconscious conditioning, I'm going to bring that into the space. And so part of that love is recognizing that and working on that and being humble enough to pause and slow down and see how can I be aware of what I'm putting out, what I'm giving out, because I love my folks so much that I don't want to wound and hurt anybody.
There's a part in that first question which is related to love that was in the queue, which the person was asking specifically about how do we accompany each other to do this, to see one another as noble and whole. And they were referring to whites who feel left out, often from poverty, and they may have more conservative views. So the question was referring, how do we accompany each other to do this, to see them as noble as well? And I think you all partially answered that, but if Sahar, if maybe you want to, maybe expound on that, that'd be great. If you have any thoughts on that.
Sorry, can you clarify the question?
Sure. The question is specifically referring to a group of people amongst our population, poor whites, who have felt left out of opportunity and who have made, and Layli kind of referred to this in the first half of our discussion, where she talked about, racism sometimes is born out of this, deprivation, a sense of deprivation and lack of resources. So the questioner is essentially asking, in regards to this divine love, how do we accompany each other to see these individuals who might be classified as being more conservative and maybe holding some biased or prejudiced views, to see them as noble and as well?
Yeah, because I got all the answers for that. So, not even. So I think, speaking of humble posture of learning, I think that's what it takes. There's a lot, because of how the discourse has been going, there's been intentional demarcations of who is allowed to speak and who is not, because of historically what has been the case in terms of spaces, right? And so we're kind of replicating that in new ways. And I think it takes a lot of humility of the self to be like, you know what, this person is also noble. And I think it goes to this idea of love, divine love, from even what it says in this paragraph is, the last sentence, the second to last sentence says, infuse it into every neighborhood and social space in which you move to build capacity to canalize the society. So we're channels. So the fact that it's divine love has nothing to do with me. That means I have to completely detach and make sure I'm not clogged, don't have any clogs or obstacles to allow that flow to go. And to have those prejudices of even people who are more conservative, who are white, who may not know certain things or experiences or may not be privy to them, whatever assumptions or labels we put on people. I think it's a reminder that the divine love has nothing to do with us. We're just the channels, basically. Like, I can't control what it looks like, but I can use it, its potency and its power, its spiritual power, to be able to have conversations with people. But I don't think it can go alone without, I don't think it can be, manifested without a humble posture of learning. I don't think this divine love is possible without it. And I think that's why it's interesting, the transition from having this humble posture of learning to this idea of divine love.
Yeah.
You know, it reminds me of Dennis, you were talking about students, and I always say, how can I tell my students I love them without scaring them? You know, but I think it's I need to show them that I love them, and I need to find ways to show them, and it'll be different depending on which student I'm talking to or connecting with. And I think the humble posture of learning, of checking ourselves, like Dennis was saying earlier, looking in the mirror and saying that just because someone is a poor white who might statistically have a more conservative view that I don't agree with, does that mean that we shouldn't have a conversation? You know, that we shouldn't act, that doesn't take that work. It's going to be hard, difficult, ugly work we don't want to do, but we have to.
Thank you so much. It makes me think, and I'll just say this real quick, but you know, when I think of myself and I'm praying for forgiveness for something that I've done or things that I've done, I'm so grateful that in the writings, there's this idea of separating behavior from your inherent nobility. We're all inherently noble. The behavior may or may not reflect our nobility, but the behavior can't take away from our inherent nobility. And I remember I was doing an artist residency in Texas, and I wrote this article about an experience there. There's a racialized experience, and then I started getting some hate mail. And I remember one guy really went after me and said, "Don't you ever come back to this town. You'll be sorry if you do." And I just kept referring to him as brother. And he said, "I'm not your brother." I said, "Yes, you are. You don't know it, but you are." You know, so, you know, that's the challenge, I think, is I know for me, is to always think that this is behavior. It doesn't take away from the nobility of how you were created. You were created noble. That's the raw material of how you were made. You're acting like a fool, but you're still a noble being. So, and it's just a thought I had.
I wanted to add a couple.
Please, go ahead.
To me, this is a very practical matter. And I think that there are two expressions of love that are very powerful across difference. One of them is compassion, and the other one is authenticity. Let me give you a couple of examples. Let's say that I'm in my workplace, a place where people have all kinds of opinionated differences, and some people are this and that, and some people are this and the other thing. And let's say that one of my colleagues' mother has died. Now, my colleague could be my arch rival politically, could be any kind of person that I normally would disagree with. I'm still going to say, you know what, it really breaks my heart that your mom passed away, and I want to give you my condolences. And I can be genuine about that. And I'm not thinking, well, let me not give my condolences because you don't agree with me in one way or another, or because you've said something to offend me in the past. We all understand that that's a traumatizing event for any person, no matter who they are, and you can reach out. Another example would be the ability to give another person a compliment. You know, I can compliment a person no matter what they think or what they've said to me. I can say, you know what, I love your shirt. Where'd you get that? I can say, great manicure, it's cute. You know, I can say, you know, you seemed so happy a minute ago, or that was a great joke that you told. You know, there are those very mundane, everyday moments that every single day are openings for connection, openings for starting a friendship, openings for building the kind of trust that can make those harder, deeper conversations possible later. And if you're not always on the lookout for those things and not using those opportunities, then you're missing the opportunity to unify. So I think that there's a very, very practical, everyday dimension to this process.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Layli. It's so important.
I want to,
Please.
talking about application.
Yeah.
Layli, you just opened the door. I was thinking about this thing called relationship and opportunities that we look for in order to connect deeper. It's really as simple as, what is the nature of your relationship, or how deep is your relationship, in terms of how hard are you willing to work to have honesty and to have real, true conversation, right? So if we don't have any type of relationship, there is no opportunity to connect. Because then if I'm standing in a workplace and you step on my foot, for instance, I'm going to say, you know, ouch, you're on my foot. And then I'm going to have all these ideas in my head as to about why you stepped on my foot that may or may not be correct, right? But if I have a relationship and you step on my foot, ouch, you stepped on my foot, now let's talk about it, right? We're going to talk about that instead of me making assumptions about why you stepped on my foot. We can have a real honest conversation about that. But if there's nobody's vested You know, nobody's invested in having a conversation beyond the superficial. And so people walk away from an exchange with whatever their concept is, or whatever their learning is, or whatever their context is, and they walk away without an opportunity to have a real connection, because nobody wants to take that time to make that happen. We're lazy. We're living in a microwave society. We want instant this, instant that. Relationships take time. And we can take the time to foster those relationships, healthy relationships, I might add. Then we can start having these conversations that Layli is talking about. But it has to start somewhere. And it can be as simple of, good morning, how are you? And then it can grow from that and grow from that until we can start developing opportunities to have real relationships, because a lot of our relationships are not equitable. And we are really good. When I say we, a lot of Black folks, we're really good at wearing masks because we have to, because we've had to protect ourselves. And so you may think that you have a real deep, equitable relationship with the people or the person of color. It may not be as deep and equitable as you think it is. And there is some responsibility on Black folks as well. And the Guardian talks about that too, right? It's not just a one-way street, it's a two-way street. But I think when you develop those deeper relationships, then you have an opportunity to have frank, honest, and loving consultation. And without that, then you're just not really you're not gonna get those opportunities to have authenticity, which then develops into a deeper type of, a real type of love.
That's your point. The point that you're making, Dennis, I think leads into this question that I'm hearing a kind of plea from this this contributor. She's saying that some white Baha'is are burdened with profound guilt over past injustice. Any thoughts about what such folks might consider to assist in resolving this burden? I don't feel I can expect to be forgiven. Yeah. And it might be worth mentioning that the guidance that you're talking about, Dennis, from I think it was you, yeah, from the Guardian about what whites and Blacks need to do in this process. Whites have to demonstrate themselves worthy of being trusted, and then Blacks have to demonstrate their readiness to forgive. So that twofold process. So if anybody has any thoughts, I'd love to hear them. Layli?
Dennis, you are on mute. Go ahead.
He's passing the mic.
Okay, well, so I'm always coming at it from the perspective of a psychologist, but one in which I'm always thinking about the social context. You know, guilt is one of those emotions that if we keep it alive for long periods of time, it becomes entrenched physically in our nervous system. But our nervous system, we know, is a malleable organ. And what the instrument that we have to rewrite our nervous system is our own mind and our own thoughts. So you have to change the thoughts that you have. You have to have a way to talk back to yourself that feels guilty. And you have to come up with new evidence about what's going on. The other thing is in the realm of action. If you are taking actions that you know actively subvert the things that cause that guilt, and you are being restorative in society, then you know that you have positive evidence to overwrite the past story of guilt. And so we do have responsibility not to carry our guilt around. You know, we have sort of guilt Olympics at times. We don't want people to be part of that. What we want people to do is say, okay, past injustices occurred. Either I was part of that or my ancestors were part of that. But my goal now is to make sure that those things are not active and present in society. And let me analyze what my personal power is to do something about that. Let me not imagine that I can save the whole world, but let me figure out the 5 things that I can do and do those 5 things. And if you do that, you will find that people appreciate you and that your own mind changes.
Thank you. Thank you, Layli.
I also think that part of it, and I'm going to use myself as an example, is an acknowledgement of past hurt or past pain or your privilege. I am fully aware of my male privilege. And I know I don't have to experience and go through things that my sisters have to go through. I don't think about when I'm traveling, I don't think about where I park. I don't think about where my hotel room is. I don't think about any of those things. But my dear sisters have to think about that every day, right? And I found when I talk to my sisters in that way, it opens up a portal, right? So I think if we don't confess, but we acknowledge how we have gained advantage. I've gained advantage from my maleness that I did not earn. And so I can empathize with my sisters, right? And so when we start talking about this pandemic, the old pandemic, the first knee gut response from some white folks is, I had nothing to do with that. My parents didn't, I didn't, okay, stop it. You have benefited from that system. And I think an acknowledgement of that creates the opportunity to connect deeper with folks of color. And so I think we have to really, that's a humble posture, right? I have to have some humility so I can connect deeper with my sisters, telling them I benefit from male privilege. I didn't earn it, but I benefit from it, and it creates an opportunity. So I think there has to be that acknowledgement, and that passage from the Advent of Divine Justice is right on spot, Masud, where Shoghi Effendi talks about what white people have to do and what Black people have to do. And mind you, he does refer to Black people as Negroes, but that was the language of that time. And we don't change our writings. You know, that's what it is. And so I think it would be very important for people to go back to that section and really study that and embrace that and internalize that and let that guide you in your interactions so you can get off of that. Just let that stuff go, right? And understand that we are where we are for a reason. And acknowledge the advantage that you have received from that. Not that you should feel sorry or feel guilty about it, but an acknowledgement, right? So that you can gain empathy. So then you can start beginning to have some real conversations, because we have to kind of take a step back and we're always waiting. And I know women are too, for that backhanded compliment, right? We're going along, oh, here it comes, oh, there it is. And it just shuts the door, right? But with a humble posture of learning, you learn to hold your peace and be sensitive to the folks that you are interacting with, and be mindful of your words and be mindful of your spirit to think about, how do I connect? How do I create this love? And part of that is an acknowledgement of privilege and that you don't really have anything to do with, so that you connect with folks who don't have that privilege.
Thank you. Thank you. There's a question here that kind of jumps off of part of what you shared, Dennis, and it's about reparations. And this person asked, how can we better address reparations for all injured parties, communities, indigenous, marginalized, exploited, colonized, etc.? So they're asking about reparations and ways that I guess we can better address those issues. Any thoughts on that? I know it's kind of a broad question, but maybe there's some ways that we can, unpack that with some specifics. Anyone? Sahar, you have any thoughts?
There's in the Caribbean, there's a coalition of people trying to seek reparations from, the European colonies that came to the Caribbean. And the list is really long, and it keeps evolving and evolving and evolving. If you, look it up, this, the Caribbean call for reparations. And even Ta-Nehisi Coates wrote this piece, right? The Case for Reparations, a couple years back on. And there's this, I think when we talk, going back to this idea of the socioeconomic aspects of racism and the consequences and the effects of it, but then also the spiritual and moral. How do we also bring reparations for the spiritual and moral deprivations that are happening, not only to those who have been marginalized and dehumanized and enslaved and killed and lynched and murdered, but also those who are oppressing as well? you know, how do we define reparations within a context that it also just moves beyond material means, right? Because education is one idea people are saying, but what kind of education? How do you define what that education is? You know, is it the spiritual, the moral, the human, the material, and also economic, the financial reparations? I think I'm not saying I even have an answer, because I think it's a very complicated conversation. It's very multi-layered, multi-dimensional,
Mhm.
but even the idea of the truth and reconciliation commissions that have happened, you know, in like Rwanda and South Africa and El Salvador and Canada, even those, you know, those cases of reconciliation that don't necessarily talk about reparations have also been tricky, because they still feel they're not resolved. They're still, you know, evolving in terms of the process, and people still feel that justice hasn't been received. And I think that's the thing. Do we have a unified understanding of what reparations is and what it should look like? And how does that look like, you know, within the sense that moves beyond socioeconomic reparations is something
Mhm.
I'd be interested to think about. And where do you draw the line in terms of who receives it and who doesn't?
Mhm. Mhm. Layli, any thoughts on that?
I have a few.
Mhm.
You know, I think that there are sort of two parts to reparations writ large. One part is the acknowledgement of
Mhm.
wrongs as a way of restituting the relationship between two groups of people or two people.
Mhm.
Um, and that's a psycho-spiritual process
Mhm.
um, that only completes itself when people do it with full humility and sincerity, and sometimes more than once.
Mhm.
The second part of reparations is more of an economic, political, cultural kind of constellation,
Mhm.
a restoration of wealth lost and that sort of thing. And there's part of me that feels like the best form of reparations in that regard would just be a permanently altered, better society.
Mhm.
You know, if society were functioning properly, we wouldn't need reparations, because everybody would have what they need and most of what they want.
Mhm.
You know, and we're capable of creating that world. We're not creating it. So reparations, in a way, the way it's been crafted up to now, is a stopgap. It assumes that you're going to take some action, but that the world is fundamentally going to keep operating on the same system. But that system is flawed, and we're going to keep reproducing this problem unless we change the system. And, you know, obviously that's part of the reason we're even having this racial justice series, because we want to encourage people to open the floodgates of their imaginations, to think about how that society can be different and what they can do about it. And obviously we want to offer a few ideas from the Baha'i faith about that, because some of those ideas are quite different from the main ideas circulating in the social movement sector. You know, but ultimately making the world operate the way it's supposed to operate so that people's lives are good is what's ultimately needed. There's nothing less than that.
Mm, mm. Interesting question here. Says, I am white. I live in a predominantly white community in which a large number of the workers are persons of color. When I'm riding a bike or walking, I make a point of acknowledging these individuals by waving and saying good morning. Since the murder of George Floyd, I'll place my hand over my heart and bow my head. I'm receiving mixed responses. Some appear genuinely happy to receive a greeting, some scowl. How might my greeting be interpreted by persons not used to being acknowledged? Is this an appropriate attempt to reach out to persons not used to being acknowledged as they go about their work? Dennis, what are you thinking, brother?
It's, it's very interesting,
Mm-hmm.
and it's very heavy, you know, and it's there's no one quick fix and there's no magic pill, right?
Mm-hmm.
But I do believe that it takes time.
Yeah.
It takes time.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of cultures, particularly cultures of color, people have to believe that you mean it.
Yeah.
Right? So lots of times, I remember a real quick story. We were at this Baha'i function and in Arkansas, where they have a large population of people from the Pacific Islands, where they did nuclear testing on their island. The name of the group evades me right now, but they came to a summer school, And they walked into the room, and there were 25 or 30 of them. And they came in the room so quietly that you almost didn't know that they were there, right? And so my wife and I got up out of our seats and went to each one of them and greeted them and shook their hand and made eye contact with them and acknowledged their presence. Later that evening, we were playing games, and Marshallese, they're from the Marshall Islands. All the Marshallese kids were sitting by themselves, and all the rest of the kids were playing games. And so I asked the kids, I said, why aren't you playing with all the kids? And they said, well, they didn't want to play. I said, well, how do you know? Did you ask them? And they said, well, no, we didn't really ask them. And I said, well, go ask them to play. And so the kid went over there, asked him to play. He came back, his head was down. They said, no. I said, go ask him again. He went over there, asked him again, and he came back and he said no. And he was feeling even more defeated, right? And so I went up and I said, watch this. I walk over to the kids. I say, come on, let's play soccer. They say no. I said, yes, come on, come on. And after about the 6th or 7th time, they all got up and they started playing. And so the kid was like, how did you do that? What? I said, sometimes it takes time. And they have to believe that you are genuine in your efforts. And when you are genuine in your efforts and you demonstrate that by being consistent, then things change. Sometimes we want things to change just like that. But you have to think about the experiences that some people of color have had with people who don't look like them. And to think that 1 or 2 simple gestures is going to cause them to open up their arms and then accept you, that's not reality. And you just have to be humble, and you have to be genuine, and you have to be consistent, and you have to mean it. Things will happen.
It reminds me of that quote from The Guardian from Shoghi Effendi, where he says, he talks about the slow healing wounds of people of African descent. And what you're talking about, that just showing up, being consistent, being patient, helps to heal some of those slow healing wounds.
There's a lot of mistrust, brother. There's a lot of mistrust.
Yes.
And it's not going to change over 1 or 2 invitations.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I have to, before I forget, Dennis, I do want to acknowledge what you said earlier, where you talked about that kind of hypervigilance and how you go through the world and you're very aware of your spaces, the spaces that you're in. That resonated so truthfully with me. And I just want to thank you for being so transparent and sharing that, because I think a lot of times people don't realize, again, how racism operates in the subconscious. You know, how you don't even know why you're responding the way you are, but you're so on guard because of that kind of hypervigilance. So I just wanted to acknowledge that before I forget.
That's why I want to say this real quick.
Yeah.
That's why the Black Men's Gathering experience was so transformative. There was a space where we could be and not worry about being viewed, examined, watched. That's why it was so transformative. But I and the sisters get the same thing in their spaces.
Absolutely.
Get the same thing. Absolutely.
Thank you, brother. Layli, you're going to say something, please?
Yeah, and actually just building on what Dennis said, I would encourage particularly all Baha'is, especially white Baha'is, to go back and look at the recent Greenacre videos about the Black Men's Gathering if you're not already familiar with it, so you can get accustomed to what that space was like and the function that it fulfilled in the spirit and the psyche of Black Baha'is, especially men in the United States. And to the questioner that you mentioned earlier, Masud, I wanted to make the comment that, there are kind of two parts to what white people more broadly are being asked to do, or it's multiple parts, but 2 that I want to comment on. The questioner in terms of greeting Black people and expressing genuine compassion in her neighborhood where maybe previously that wasn't the communication norm. That is great in the sense that moving into emotional equality and friendliness with Black people is part of it. But the other thing, and I always want to say this to white people, the number one thing that Black people want you to do is change other white people. And that's the one power that you have that we don't have in the same way, which is to go to your other white people and say, I have a new view. I'd like to invite you to this view with me. There are other ways to do things in this world than the way we've been doing them. And I'd like to ask you to change and let's do things differently. You know, that's something that I think is another frontier of white anti-racist work that I like to remind people is so important to people of color, because it's a unique thing that white people can do, and it's so, so important.
And essentially what you all are talking about, these two qualities that the House of Justice recently mentioned, right, not too long ago, these two qualities that are essential to doing this work, patience and perseverance, right? The patience to just continually show up and be present, and the perseverance to just stick with it even when it's difficult, to just continue in having that commitment in doing this work. So thank you both for that. It's wonderful. I think we probably have time for maybe 2 more questions, and I'm sorry we won't be able to get to everybody's, but we're doing the best we can. Let me see here. Oops. Okay. As the current iteration of the original slave patrols in the US is the police as an institution beyond reform? That's a question. So as the current iteration of the original slave patrols in the US is the police as an institution beyond reform? And then the second part of his question, should all police forces in America be abolished and rebuilt from the bottom up? Does the history that, well, it's another part, does the history that police in the US carry continue to weigh it towards injustice? So this essentially is about the police and the way that policing is conducted in America. Anybody want to take that?
I'll dive into that since it's
as your area of expertise.
I think the police and the way a lot of police conduct themselves is a huge problem, right? I also think that they could become a distraction because it's easy to defer to those bad folks doing bad things, right? But we have to stop and think about, where did the police come from? They came from this society. They came from right here, right? So where did they learn what they learned? They learned it in the culture of America, right? And so it's dangerous to demonize law enforcement because they are a byproduct of our society who happen to have a badge and a gun and have opportunities to inflict immediate damage upon people, right? But then when you start looking at other institutions, like teachers, I think teachers are so incredibly powerful. What damage are they inflicting upon our Black and brown people, right? They just don't have a badge and a gun, and they're not taking lives directly, right? So I think law enforcement should be held to a higher standard. I think, of course, they can be reformed. Everybody can be transformed, right? But it takes a transformative process that is steeped in spirituality, not these other factors that govern, so-called processes of change, right? Like less lawsuits and, this kind of thing, right? It has to be, it's dangerous because there isn't screening, there isn't hard screening, right? The screening should be much more rigorous. And if you have red flags in your background, you should not be allowed to be a quote unquote officer of the law. But at the same time, we have to understand that these people are products of our environment. And then until we change our environment, we're going to still be pulling people from that pool that are going to be in positions of power, this type of power that can inflict harm. So if you have, this is the problem. You have a lot of police officers who are unconsciously afraid of Black folks, particularly Black males, right? So any type of interaction that they have with a Black male is going to be misinterpreted as threatening. Anything they do is going to be misinterpreted as threatening because I'm looking through a different lens when I'm dealing with you. I'm already afraid of you. I already don't see you as a human. I don't see your nobility. I don't see your humanity. So anything that you do is going to be misinterpreted as a heightened threat. And so what am I going to do? Whatever I think I got to do to neutralize that threat. And so that's part of the problem, I believe, with law enforcement, is that you have people who are just, and a lot of people aren't even aware of their implicit bias, right? It's there, and we've done hundreds, dare I say thousands of tests with police departments, and it's ferreted this out. There is bias towards particularly Black folks, particularly Black males. And so anything a Black male does, if we really stop and if we're honest with ourselves, some of us Black folks have negative images of young Black males, right? Where does that come from? So you take that, give a person who has that inherent or that unconscious conditioning in their hearts, and give them a badge and give them a gun, and then create this environment where you're telling people to kick butt and take names, right? Law and order, who are they going to take it out on? So I don't think it's just law enforcement, it's society as a whole that has to shift.
Yeah, thank you, Dennis. I'm going to just make a quick amendment. There's a question that I noticed that I think needs to be addressed. And it says, if we are to forgive, how can there be asking for reparations? Does a person forgive another based on the oppressor's actions? I think not. It solely falls on the oppressee. Forgiving releases the person of a prison of self. So I don't know if anyone has any thoughts on that. Layli, do you have any thoughts?
I'm not really sure exactly how to address this question. I think that forgiveness isn't the most important part of the equation when it comes to reparations. I think that when you're dealing with something as vast as a social structure like slavery or capitalism, or these sorts of things that are actually the cause of the whole discussion about reparations, that the issue is more about moral righting and about restitution than it is about forgiveness. I think forgiveness is something that happens between individuals, but we're talking about societal things here, which are at a different level and require a different set of dimensions.
Sahar, any thoughts?
I think similar with Layli's thoughts, this idea of acknowledgement is really key. And I don't know if it's true that forgiveness, I think, is a more relational thing that you do between individuals, between hearts and souls, rather than an entire institution like the government and, and a particular segment of society that is seeking reparations. I do agree that, forgiveness is a form of liberation of the prison of self, with regards to us forgiving things, in general, because they say there's a saying that says when you hold anger towards someone, it's basically like you're, there's a poison you're intending for someone else, but you end up dying from that poison, right? It's like this idea of, I totally butchered that thing, but it's this idea that forgiveness is a choice for the self. And yeah, reparations seems to be a more institutional, more societal, it's a larger scale, more on the macro scale than I would say on a micro.
Yeah. Dennis, do you have anything you want to add to that? We got one last question, and then we're gonna bring it to a close.
I think the writings tell us the best beloved in my sight is justice. And I think we need to keep that in mind when we're talking about these topics such as this. And we also want to keep in mind this concept of folks being superheroes.
Yeah.
We can't expect everybody to be Nelson Mandela. Let's look at what is just. That's the first place to start.
Yeah. Thank you for that. Thank you. All right, we're going to do one last question and then we're going to bring this to a close. Let's see where we want to go. Okay. You are all very nice people and you are sincere, loving, and honest, but you all subscribe to a narrative promulgated by much of the US media that police officers routinely murder innocent Blacks. Some honest and principled Black people propose a different narrative, that crime is rampant in the American Black community and tolerated by a don't snitch mentality among Blacks and by white liberals' guilt-ridden excuses. Some of these commentators, such and such and such, they list a few names. The result is unlivable Black ghettos, fear of Blacks by whites and by police officers, and a race grievance industry that exploits both Blacks and whites. Have you any comments about this? Sorry to end it on such a hopeful note, but there we go. Anybody have any thoughts? Layli, would you like to begin? No, it's a lot.
Sure. No, I'm happy to begin.
Mm-hmm.
All life takes place in a complex ecosystem of causes and effects.
Mm.
Everything that happens is multiply caused and can be understood through different lenses. The presence of one explanation does not necessarily cancel out another explanation. Things may have overlapping causes from multiple sources. In this particular situation, we're trying to understand the effects of racism, which have had certain negative effects on Black people and certain negative effects on white people and certain negative effects on all other people in our nation. I'll take a simple piece out of that question, which is the part about unlivable Black ghettos. Why do they exist? My mind goes first to redlining as a practice that, divided up cities into places where Black people could and could not live. And the places where Black people were allowed to live were often the most undesirable parts of town, places where there was environmental pollution, places where the housing stock was of very poor quality, places where the schools were not good, places where there weren't good jobs, good supermarkets, etc. And by law, people basically were relegated to living there. If anyone had to live in those kind of conditions, certainly some untoward things would events over time. Whether white people, Black people, or people of any descent had to live in a place like that, some negative things would come from it. But it all came from a decision by those in power early on to divide people, to put some people in a situation that was not conducive to human well-being, and then to later blame those people for showing the results of being put in that situation. Shoghi Effendi talks about how Blacks and whites all have to contribute to the solution of racism, that we all have particular roles to play. I don't particularly think that the intellectual communities that the questioner is asking about have all the answers. I think that Shoghi Effendi actually has some really strong answers that help us understand in an intertwined way how we all have to do our part. And what Baha'u'llah gives us is the ability to have a generosity of spirit towards each other, where we're not just going at each other's throats about who's right and who's wrong, but rather we're saying, you're my brother, you're my sister, you're my sibling. How can we live together? How can we put this behind us? And how can we make a world in which everybody's needs are met, in which everybody's spiritual nobility is recognized, and which we come together to form a new, ever-advancing form of human civilization? So that's my response.
Thank you, Layli. Sahar, any thoughts?
There is a lot of scholarship out there that actually challenges this counter narrative of Black on Black crime used as a deflection from, the heightened police brutality that's happening against Black and brown bodies. And the only reason that people are making, more people are getting upset, because all of a sudden, as even the first sentence of the letter from the Universal House of Justice says, it's, historic portent, all of a sudden is this conscious awakening of US society. There's a hyper-mediatization, and there's also an administration that, has triggered a lot of this hyper-mediatization as well. And I think the ghettoization of people of color is has been historically systematic. And as Layli says, it is intertwined with so many different aspects that are economic when it comes to banks, banks and loans and predatory lending and redlining, and issues of, affordability and getting, gentrification. There's so many different factors. And going back to what Dennis said about the most beloved of all things in my sight is justice. There are unjust and inequitable conditions that a majority of the smallest percentage of the United States is experiencing, historically. And so this idea of the don't snitch mentality and those kind of things that happen, I think the reason why there's an amplification of certain things is because the injustice of it affects all of us. And so to kind of narrow in on just this specific aspect of stereotype and ghettoization, I think is dangerous because it perpetuates a justification or a kind of blinding and veiling from the injustices that have been happening historically on the backs and bodies of people since this nation was established in 1492. So I just think it's, yeah.
I want to piggyback right off Sahar.
Go ahead.
Because there were several facets to that question and several parts of that question. It was loaded, and I don't think it was so much a question as it was a statement.
Yeah.
Of very challenging statement, right? Mm-hmm. So I'm only going to narrow in on one part of that question, which is whoever posed the question, you simply need to learn your history because you don't understand. And if you don't understand history, you won't understand how we got to be where we are today. And Sahar talked about on the backs of Black and brown people. I'm going to read this real quick passage from The People's History of the United States, Howard Zinn. And this is Columbus, Christopher Columbus, which we have a holiday for Christopher Columbus. We have cities named after Columbus, and he has been falsely put into a position of a great explorer when we know who he really was, those of us who know history. So this is Columbus and human progress. Arawak men and women. These are the people that he quote unquote discovered that have villages and cities and governments. Arawak men and women, naked, tawny, and full of wonder, emerged from their villages onto the island's beaches and swam out to get a closer look at the strange big boat. When Columbus and his sailors came ashore carrying swords, speaking oddly, the Arawaks ran to greet them, bought them food, water, gifts. Columbus later wrote this in his log. This is from Columbus's log. Columbus, they bought us parrots and balls of cotton and spears and many other things, which they exchanged for the glass beads and hawk's bells. They willingly traded everything they owned. They were well built with good bodies and handsome features. They do not bear arms and do not know them. For I showed them a sword. They took it by the edge and cut themselves out of ignorance. They have no iron. Their spears are made of cane. They would make fine servants. With 50 men, we could subject them all and make them do whatever we want. Whoever posed the question, study your history. And then you'll understand why we are where we are and how through Baha'u'llah's revelation and the oneness of humanity, we can clean up a lot of this mess that has been created.
Yeah. Thank you so much for that, Dennis. It reminds me of the foundational principle of the Baha'i faith. Truthfulness is the foundation of all human virtues. So having a clear understanding of what reality is based on God's revelation is the best way for us to chart a successful path forward. I just want to thank you guys as we're drawing to a close for this incredible discussion. Sahar, thank you for your insight and your wisdom and correcting me on my pronunciation. I really appreciate that. That was my favorite part of the dialogue, actually. Dennis, brother, thank you for your passion, man, and your commitment and just your clarity. Really, really appreciate you, brother. Thank you so much. Layli, as always, it's always such an honor to serve with you. I learned so much from you. I appreciate you always being in this space with me. You make me better at what I do, and I'm just honored to be here with you.
Thank you for your wonderful moderation, Masud. It's also a pleasure to always work with you.
Thank
and
you so much.
Sahar, Dennis, David, everyone, Josefina, yes.
Thank you. And I think we're gonna turn it back over. Is David with us, or did he?
I am. I'm with you.
Awesome. We're gonna turn it over to David, and he's gonna bring us home. So thank you, everybody, for joining us. We hope you have a wonderful rest of the weekend, and we look forward to seeing you all next time. David, please.
Thank you, Masud. What an amazing conversation, really. And let me just start by thanking our curators, Masud and Layli, for really what was certainly one of the richest conversations that we've had. We'll be very happy to have you back next month. We've got a pretty exciting program planned. We'll keep that close to the vest here for the moment. But also thank you to Sahar and Dennis for joining us. What a rich contribution both of you have made. We'd like to thank as well Josefina Hernandez, our amazing technical director. We couldn't do any of this. We would all be all thumbs if it wasn't for Josefina. So thank you so much. And thank you to everyone for joining us. Most folks have stayed with us for the entire 2 hours. Next program, 2 weeks hence, we'll have Masud Olufani back with us. If you haven't had an opportunity to see him in a dramatic performance, you don't want to miss this. He will be joined by Derek Smith, who is the author of Robert Hayden in Verse, New Histories of African-American Poetry and the Black Arts Era. And in fact, the conversation will be about this extraordinary individual, Robert Hayden, poet laureate, the first African-American poet laureate of this country. He was in that position from 1976 through 1978. And we'll have both some background on history and some readings of some of his most important poetry. So again, thanks to everyone for joining us, and thanks to this amazing group for this contribution. It's great stuff, guys.